Good afternoon once again. Hope everybody's staying healthy, staying positive, and staying focused. Jeff Benson coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida today. As I said earlier, we're going to dissect protection classes. And it's funny, as you're, an old property guy and you think protection classes, everybody understands those. Well, not only did ISO change things a couple of years ago, but I've discovered a lot of agents really don't understand protection classes. So we're going to hopefully answer all your questions today. If you have questions, hold them till the end and we'll do our best to get to them. So when you think about property insurance, what are the rating factors that we talk about? We talk about the value, total insured value of the structure. We talk about the deductible. And then the last thing we talk about is the location. Where is the risk located? And the big thing there is either it's located next to a catastrophic area like the ocean or a fault line for a hurricane, fault line for an earthquake. But the other thing you think about is protection class. It's a major rating factor on property. To go from a protection class 1 to a 10 usually is 2 to 2.5 times the premium. And most carriers have far less capacity in the unprotected ranges, and we'll talk about that. So it affects everything. So today we're going to talk about ISO protection classes. You'll hear it called PPC, Public Protection Class. And we'll get into that. See if I can get this to work. So everybody should know what ISO is. It's the rate promulgation entity that kind of a lot of carriers use. There is some competing ones now. AEIS is for inland marine. But what most carriers do, when I say most, the vast majority, they use the ISO protection class. There is a few states, Washington, Louisiana, maybe Mississippi, they kind of have their own classes, but it's interesting that they pretty much follow the same guidelines as ISO. And I have seen a few of the major carriers, probably because they have so much data now, that they might have their own protection class rating factor. But I would say, 90% of the carriers that are writing property insurance and builder's risk are using ISO. Okay? So what are the factors that influence a protection class? And there's really, and it's funny too, this is not a subjective thing. There actually is rules out there of how they calculate these things. I know sometimes agents will call me and they think the underwriter has some kind of discretion, like I can make it a different protection class. And all I'm going to tell you is, what is it? We got to figure out what it is, because it's not negotiable as far as that goes. So 10% of what determines a protection class is called emergency communications. And that's their digital circuits, how quickly the telecommunications equipment works. Basically, how quick do they pick up the 911, I guess. So that's 10%. 40% of the class is water supply. And there's a lot of different things that do. Where do they have a hydrant? Do they have enough flow? Are the pipes big enough to handle the flow that's required in order to get a certain protection class? So it's the supply system, it's the hydrant size, the type of hydrant, and how the hydrant's installed. That's 40%. And 50% is the fire department itself. And that's not only the location, how far the risk is from the fire department, but what's the quality of the fire department? They have these rigorous tests. Did they pass the test? Is it a manned fire department all the time? Is it volunteer? We'll get into that a little bit later. So that's really the three factors: communications, water supply, and the fire department itself. So let's talk just for a second. What's the impact of having a higher class? So put it this way, here in Jacksonville, there was a neighborhood, and we're going to get into developments in a little bit, but they built nice houses, but it was a protection class 10 because they didn't put the fire hydrants in. So here are these people that had pretty nice houses, and they were paying 2, 3, 4 times more in homeowners insurance. So do you think that, kind of hurt the sale of the houses once that got out? Based on where the fire station is located and where the hydrants are, even though you think it's in a community, it might not be protected. So it has a lot. Today we're going to go, and I'm going to explain what split classes are. Things have changed. You used to see the 4/9. Now it's 4/4X, and I'm going to explain that, or it could be 4/4Y. I will explain that. Brush fire territories, we're going to touch on that simply because you have a lot of, mainly in California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, the whole West, you have a lot of unprotected areas where people are building houses. And so now there's a whole new rating factor called the brush fire index, I guess you'll call it. We get that from one of our systems. And now the effect of urban sprawl. As these cities build out further and further, what we've discovered, and I'll show you an example in Texas, what happened recently where they built a nice subdivision, but they didn't put enough hydrants in. So you have these literally multi-million-dollar homes with no fire hydrants, so no water supply. So do you think they're paying a lot for homeowners and their builders just was expensive? Yeah, to say the least it was. Impact of mountainous terrain. When I look at a map of the United States, I have an ISO map and it shows me all of the protection classes. The vast majority of the 9s and 10s are in mountainous areas, be it in the East Coast, the West Coast. Anywhere you have mountains, you're going to have some unprotected areas, not only for the fire hydrants, but the lack of fire departments and the lack of water supply. Think about being on top of a mountain, even if there's a pond up there. What happens to the pond in the winter? So the volunteer fire department gets out there and says, we're going to extract water from the pond. Oops, the pond is frozen. Or about the roads leading to the structure, maybe they're frozen too, so you can't even get to it. So you get the idea that mountainous terrain is tough. High value dwellings. We see a lot of very expensive homes being built, and the people buy a lot of land and they think, I don't want to be close to my neighbors, I want to be out by myself. So they build this multi-family, multi-million-dollar home, not thinking that it's unprotected. So there's no fire protection. So once again, the builder's risk will be very expensive, the homeowners will be very expensive, and it's basically just unprotected. Smaller towns and rural communities, what I see a lot there is the split classes. We had one in Montana, and it was a 4/9. And so each thing that we wrote there, we'd have to map that individual risk. And if it was east of this street, it was a 4, but if it was west of the street, it was a 9. So it was like, it's pretty finite when you look at it that way. Okay, let's take a stab at this, and you're going to be experts when I get through this. Split classes. Used to be 4/9 the way it did. Well, they changed that. So you really have the two factors we're going to talk about: the distance to the responding fire department and the property located within 1,000 feet of a credible water supply. What we've seen, and this happened to us recently in Texas, where a nice development, they're building these houses, they thought it was protected, but they had not put in enough fire hydrants. And so even though the fire department was only 3.5 miles away, because interesting, I actually talked to the builder, the developer of the area, and I talked to the local fire department. And they said, that's why we put in the substation, so there would be a fire department close to this development. So they got the distance to the fire department, but they said, but we didn't put in enough hydrants. And so what you're building right here is over 1,000 feet from a hydrant. So instead of being a 4, it was a 9. And in the new world order, it would be a 4x. So there is no 4/9, now it's 4x. Now I will say what they've determined is, the reason they did this is the 4x, even though it's very similar to the 9, they recognize the fact that the fire department's less than 5 miles away. So it is a better risk than if it was a true protection class 9. So you get a little better, a little break on the rate, but not much. And this is where the underwriter in me comes out too. So in this instance, one of my competitors, some companies, you put in the address of a project and it'll give you back the protection class. Well, a good buddy of mine was the agent on this. We put it in the carrier's system, hit the button, and it came back as a 4, even though it actually was a 4x. So their system was wrong. I just feel like calling them and telling them that, but I didn't. But if they knew that they were, on a multi-million-dollar risk and it was truly unprotected, you think they would want to know that? I think as an underwriter, you would want to know that. So kind of the moral of this story is, if I was an agent in a given area writing business, I would call the local fire department and have the conversation with them. They'll tell you, because they're the ones that put the hydrants in, they put the pipes in. We had a situation where a small town put hydrants in, but for whatever reason, the pipes weren't big enough. So it didn't pass the ISO inspection because they had hydrants, but they had too small a pipe. So it does happen. So hopefully you understand 4/9 is now 4/4x. And now the other one that you'll see sometimes, you used to see 4/8B. 8B was a class that kind of recognized the same things, even though it was close to unprotected. There was a fire department close by, there was some water supply, so you got a little break on that. So now instead of being a 4/8B, it will be a 4/4Y. So, and each carrier is going to underwrite that differently depending on whether they look at that as protected or unprotected. I will say pretty much universal 4-4X. If you're in the 4X portion of that community, it's unprotected. And this is all about ISO trying to be more accurate. Their rates will reflect the exposure. So, I mean, the #1 exposure to property in the United States is fire. I know we think about wind and earthquake and flood, but the one thing is fire. So this is critical to the overall promulgation of rates in the United States and how we get our rates. And ISO is just trying to be more precise so the rates reflect the exposure. Simple as that. And here's another thought too, and I'm not going to answer this. I'm just going to plant the thought in your head. So let's say you fill out an application and you don't know. You think it's a 4, but it might be a 9. And you know, well, this is going to double the premium, so I'm just going to make it a 4 and I'm going to send that in. But what if it ends up being a 9? Do you think the carrier could say material misrepresentation? You should have known that was a 9, even though you told me it was a 4. We'll discuss that another day, you know, the legal side of that. But I would rather get it right. You know, most agents that I talk to, so I just want to get it right. So that's why we're here talking about this today. So we have career fire departments and volunteer fire departments. Pretty much the thing you think about. Career is full-time, manned by people that are professional firemen. That's what, you know, most of the time in cities are protected. You know, we're looking at career fire departments. I will say this, volunteer fire departments, this does not mean you could have, I've seen a protection class 3 in a volunteer fire department because they passed all the inspections, their response times were good, their water supply was good, their location was good. So even though it was volunteer, it was still a protection class 3. I'm just pointing this out because what we do when we write a risk, a high valued risk, is I will look at the volunteer fire department. Most of them have a website, and I'll look at their equipment, I'll look at their ratings, and it kind of makes me feel better as an underwriter that even though I'm writing something that might be on the edge, there's a very qualified fire department in the area. So that's very critical in the mountainous areas too. This is just knowing the protection classes, and all companies do this different. For our program, we have 1 to 8, we kind of treat the same, and then 9 and 10, we treat separate. I have seen a lot of companies that will break out those middle classes, 6, 7, and 8, treat them differently than the 1 to 5s. Pretty much everybody treats the 9 and 10 as unprotected though. So that's, some won't write 10 at all. They'll only write the 9s because there is a difference. Usually the 9 meets the criteria for the fire department distance, but not the credible water supply. The 10 doesn't meet either one. So it's hard to write some of the properties on 10s now. I'm sure some of you go through that. Maybe you have to go to Lloyd's and get a stripped down form or something. I don't know. Interesting, I was reading about this earlier today. So of all the classes, the most common in the United States is protection class 5. That's good. Second most common is protection class 4. And the third most common is protection class 6. But now here's where it gets interesting. The fourth most class with the most properties in it is protection class 9. So you got 5, 4, 6, and then 9. So there is an awful lot of 9 out there. And so that's what we really have to hone in on this, because most companies, you know, 1 to 5 is going to be the same. And I will say this, a lot of times I get these agents that submit and they say, I think it's a protection class 8. There's actually not that much 8 out there, so I'll take a hard look at it. Usually, not to pick on them, but usually when I look at it hard, it's a 9, it's not an 8. Just a little tip for you. So, but it's all very important. So what we're going to do is open this up for questions. Let's go back to previous. We kind of covered protection classes 1 to 10, 1 being the best, 10 being the worst. They all fit in the middle there. Water supply, distance to the fire department. Let's open it up to questions and see if we got any questions today.
All right, Jeff, we have the first question is sort of a specific. Where can you get credible ISO PC intel for Alaska and the neighborhoods in and around major cities?
So I heard that Alaska, they asked me about Alaska.
Yes,
We do
Alaska.
write business in Alaska. And interestingly enough, Alaska has an awful lot of 9 and 10. So I will say you need to, to get credible data, I would go to the local fire department. Simply as what I said, I'd pick up the phone and call them. If it's Anchorage or whatever city it is, tell them where you're at. They'll be able to tell you that. They have to, because they have to go through accreditation. But one of the biggest issues we have in Alaska is 9 and 10, and things freeze up there a lot. So the credible water supply might be frozen. So that's another issue, or might not be able to get to it. So, we will write business up there, but we got to make sure we get the right class. Good question.
All right, next question. How can you work to change your ISO rating for a better rating?
Good question. I did a lot of reading on that too. And that's really for the municipality or for the fire department itself. There's all these factors. I only went over the 3 major categories, and each one of those categories, like the fire department category, has like 10 different subsets of things they can do to improve their equipment, improve the training of their staff. It's just, there's a bunch of things they can do. And I have seen, it makes a big difference to municipality, especially if it's a small town trying to attract developers. The fire department, the quality of that has a lot to do with that, simply because the cost, and to the individual homeowner, like I said, if I had 2 homes and they were just about the same, and one was a 9 and one was a 3, where do you think I'd want to go? It's like, you have to start thinking about that. Good question. So that's really, it's really up to the municipality to do that. But you could probably drive that. You could help them. So.
All right. So what rating do you look for when you look up the fire department?
You are looking for the ISO protection class, or sometimes it's called the PPC. I've heard it called that before. But the fire departments will know that when you say that. Because like I said, they have to go through very rigorous qualifications to try to get to where they're at. So they know about it. And I had a really good talk with the fire department in Texas on that one. It was split class. And he even admitted to me, he goes, yeah, we made some mistakes because we didn't put enough hydrants out there and our pipes aren't big enough, but we're going to rectify that. They just have to go back to the taxpayers to get a little bit more tax money to build the stuff. So I do find it interesting when they're building the development, you think they would put that stuff in first. And sometimes they don't. That's the other issue we have, is they're building a new development and there's no hydrants at all. I'm like, oh, we're going to add those later. It makes sense to add them now while we're building them. So good question.
All right. So does a dry hydrant account for a lower protection class?
A dry hydrant. I have heard that term, and I'd be taking a shot if I knew, but I think we're going to have to go to credible water supply. So I think the dry hydrant is not as good as one that has water flowing to it all the time. But I'll get back to you on that. I'll have to do a little more research on that. I have heard that term, but I don't know.
All right. We had a question if you could repeat the 3 factors, those communication and water supply, and the third one.
All right, 3 major factors of how a protection class is assigned to a given area. First one is emergency communications, the digital circuits, the effectiveness of the phone systems and all that. The second one would be the fire department itself. Usually that's the quality of the fire department and where the fire department is located relative to the risk we're insuring. And the fourth one is the water supply. So communications, fire department, water supply.
All right. Now in California, can you be protection class 2 but near a brush area?
Yeah, I mean, the brush fire itself doesn't affect the protection class. I just threw that in there because a lot of, like, we use it now. We have a core logic risk meter, which gives us all the flood zones and all of that. And they now have what they call a brush fire factor. So we kind of use that in our underwriting. So it's a number that they assign. So we look at it, and if it's a brush fire factor of 90, regardless of what the protection class is, we're going to take a hard look at it. But I will say, our program, we don't really want to write any 9 and 10 in brush fire areas. because that's where you really get in trouble. You know, and some examples, Los Angeles is a great example where you can be a 3 or even a 2. I don't know if there's any 1s there, but you can be a 2 and look up on the mountain and they're building a big house and you can see it, and that's a 9 or a 10, and you can see it. So it's hard for agents or anybody to think, how could it be that much different between where I'm standing and where that thing's being built? And it's based on those factors that I told you about, but it's probably based on credible water supply. There's no hydrants up there. There's no water up there. So sometimes the local fire department makes up for some of that by having these very sophisticated tanker trucks. And that's why sometimes in some areas, you can get something like a protection class 6, 7, or 8, even though they don't have hydrants, because they have these big tankers and they can prove so much flow for so much time. I read one where if the tanker can have 250 gallons a minute for 2 hours, then that's the same as having a hydrant. So there are some exceptions to that, but that's probably unusual. So hopefully I answered your question. But California is another one of those places we look at very carefully, because not only the brush fires, but because where they build in the mountainous terrain. So.
All right. Is there any situation where a fire department rating lowers, which changes your protection class, and who would watch out for that?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't think I've ever seen that, but it could happen. I mean, what if you had a volunteer fire department and they lost their funding or something, and all of a sudden their ratings went down? It could impact the protection class. Once again, you know, your carriers a lot of times will provide you with the protection class, but if they don't, I think it is your responsibility as an agent. And like I said, most of what I've done is I pick up the phone and call them, and they'd be surprised. The fire department's kind of like talking to you. I mean, most people aren't very interested in that, and you know, to me, you know, they're very, most of the time they're very proud of what they've done, so they want to talk about it. But I will say here in Jacksonville, the development I was telling you about was right in town, and it was a 9, and the people were irate with their homeowners insurance, and it actually was one of the main stories in the paper. It was like on the front page, you know, because the people that lived there said, we didn't know this, we wouldn't have bought a house in here if we knew this. So it is pretty important parts of the country. So.
All right. Now, would a fire department bringing their own water supply automatically be a protection class 9?
No, I mean, like I said, you know, if you can prove that your pumper truck has so much water that it can, and I think it was 250 gallons a minute, don't quote me on that. There was some flow rate, and it's based on duration. So if you can get the pumper truck there, your response time is quick, and you can produce X amount of water over I think it's a 2-hour period, then you could actually be protected. You might even be a 6, 7, or an 8, even though there's no hydrant. But that's going to be up to that fire department to get certified correctly, and it is based on the quality of their pumper trucks. Sometimes, usually I've seen a lot of 9s, and they might have, I've seen developers that will actually install a water tank, you know, and say, well, that's where we're going to get the water. Usually it doesn't produce enough flow to justify a protected class, but it would help if I was underwriting it and I knew there was a 10,000 gallon water tank there. That would probably influence my underwriting, my pricing.
Okay. So do they rate off the closest station? The point being, what if a mile away you have a volunteer fire department, but then a mile and a half away you have a non-volunteer city department?
All I've ever seen is the distance to the nearest responding fire department. So it would be what is the nearest one. To keep in mind, I think you're getting caught up in that volunteer. It can be volunteer and still have protected areas if it meets those qualifications of the fire department. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad just because it's volunteer. I know I've seen 3s that are volunteers. So I don't know if I've ever seen a 1 or a 2, but.
All right. Can a business put in a pond to try and improve its protection class?
I mean, you could have, I've seen them say, well, we're going to fill the swimming pool up while the building's being built. So we got a swimming pool, or we have a pond or a lake next door. Absolutely, that is a credible water supply. But then it goes back to the quality of the equipment and the ability to extract that water. And big problem is in the cold climates. It's like, things freeze. And so it's just not credible. It's not credible if it's frozen. So yes, it would matter. And I think some of those things, even if you don't get a break on the protection class, the underwriter will factor that into their pricing and their capacity they're willing to write. So it is something. I mean, I was asked by an agent because they gave me the number of helicopters in Los Angeles that could respond to a fire. That was interesting. I mean, they do respond. I couldn't really factor that into my rating, but it was an interesting little bit of information.
Okay, so who decides what is a credible water supply?
ISO decides, and they're gonna base it on all those factors we talked about. There's like, I don't remember all. There's probably a half a dozen factors, but one is just the flow rate's number one. It's credible. The higher the flow rate, the more credible it is. Obviously, if it's public water, that's pretty credible. If you're extracting water from some other body of water, it's not as credible. Things like that. There's a whole range of factors. I don't know them all, but they will determine that. But keep in mind, it's flow rate and duration. That's really what they're after.
Okay, so oh, sorry, just read that one. Do you know if the PPC is listed on the property report card from the county assessor's site?
Yeah, I don't know that. I do know at times it's hard to find. I mean, because we'll ask you guys will submit a piece of business and there's no protection class. So I come back to you and say, what is it? And you'll say, I don't know. And the builder doesn't know. I'm not blaming the builder. He doesn't know. And or the homeowner, the guy building it, they don't know. So nobody seems to know. So, really the only way, if you don't have one, if you don't know what it is, you have to go to the local fire department and they will know. They'll know. Now, one time I called and I think I got the receptionist. She didn't know, but a lot of times on the smaller towns, small fire departments, I'll actually talk to the chief, fire chief, and they like talking about stuff. They'll tell you all about the history of where it is. Now, I will say this too: if you're riding in a given area, you're going to know the protection class. I mean, unless it's out a ways from things, And so, I mean, if you've been writing business in a given city for a long time and you know where the fire department is and this is an established area, pretty much safe to assume a 3's a 3. But I will warn you, another place that's very tricky is Long Island. In Long Island, you got Suffolk County, and as you go further out east, a lot of those really nice places they're building out there are unprotected because no credible water supply, no fire hydrants. Talking about $2, $3, $4 million and up, these homes are building out there. And they got the double whammy. They're on the beach and they're unprotected. So what do you think a property underwriter thinks about that? Anyway, just a little tip.
All right, so do high winds in a particular area factor into protection class rating?
Not that I know of. I mean, it factors into the underwriting, but it does not factor into the protection class. It's really those three that we keep going back to that, but it's communications, water supply, and fire department. Now the brush fire factor probably does have something to do with the convective winds too, but that's something different. That's not the PPC. Good question.
All right, so for a remote home or structure, who qualifies a water tank to improve the rating?
I mean, ISO controls all of this. This is proprietary information for ISO. So that's the way it's not as readily available as you'd like, because they want to charge you to look it up. That's part of it. But they have the sole control over what the protection class is. So as a municipality or a given area, if you want to get improved, you've got to call them and they have to come out and inspect things. They'll inspect it and then they'll assign a new protection class. I do see that a lot of times with a new development, and the agent will say, oh, no, they assured us it's going to be a 3. Well, from an underwriting standpoint, I can't assign it a 3 if it's a 9. I can do it a 3 if it's 3 or 9. So I'm saying it's like, it might be something in the future, but that's not good enough for us. And that is problematic sometimes. Because I think sometimes agents think as underwriters, we have discretion. And if we're underwriting correctly, we don't. We have to go with whatever the class is. Good question, though.
Okay. Does ISO have local maps that indicate PC?
You know, they used to, but I guess I'm dating myself because I remember looking at ISO maps, but they don't put it out anymore, probably because things are changing so fast. I mean, they'd print a map and then it would change, you know, as they develop it. And I do think over time, obviously, I would hope that the 9 and 10 is becoming a smaller part of the territory. The one exception to that would be the mountains. It's going to be hard to put those fire hydrants up on top of a mountain. But to my knowledge, there is no current map that would, you know, would work. Now, you might be able to get a fairly current map, like on a local level, maybe even on a county level. I go back to that one that we did in Montana, and I actually found a county map, and it had the protection class line. And I could see where if you were east of this road, then it was a 4, and you were west of the road, it was a 9. And that made sense, and so that's what I used. So maybe on a local level, you could find one.
All right, let's do one last question.
Okay.
So what about a company's specific fire line?
I mean, I kind of touched on that earlier, so I'll answer that one of two ways. So, you know, a lot of carriers do now have the lookup ability. So, you know, we don't, but some companies do, where you put in the address and you hit a button and it gives you the protection class. Like I said, I've found a lot of those aren't very accurate, but if that company will accept that, then that's fine. So that's one way. I have started to see some of the very large companies, mostly personal lines, that now have their own protection class rating. I guess they feel like they've written so much property that their data is as credible as ISO. But that will not be across all companies. That's just for their own risk they're writing. Like I said, I've only seen that in personal lines. So a few states have their own protection class system. Like I said, Washington, Louisiana, maybe Mississippi. So they don't have ISO protection class. They have the Fire Washington protection class, and they assign a number. But I think it uses the same factors as ISO, so it's not that much different. But I will say that. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of it as far as other fire lines or other lines in the sand, however you want to look at it. Well, is that it, Darcy?
All right, we have a couple more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. So Jeff will just get back to you on that.
Yeah, go ahead and make sure. If you haven't been writing, I'll give you a call. We'll talk about it. And just for our next webinar, we're going to talk about another thing that seems to come up every day, but it's kind of like, when does this coverage start and when does it end? You know, it's pretty important. Get that right too. So stay tuned for that. I greatly appreciate your time today. And as always, if you have any questions, give me a call anytime. Give Donna a call. Pick up, send me an email. You know, I'm here to help you in any way I can. And I'll leave you with that. You know, stay positive and stay healthy. I think those are the words of the day. Thanks again, and have a great day.